in the book of Job, and we'll get to our study in just a moment. But before we do, let's have a word of prayer. And tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to remind us of the people that we've been praying for, but today is September 11th, and we remember those horrific events that happened 23 years ago. And as such, I found a prayer written by Walter Brueggemann, who's a Bible scholar and Old Testament scholar and Old Testament theologian. And it's a prayer that he delivered just a few days after September 11th, 2001. He delivered it September 17th. And it's a prayer that I sent out in our church email today, but I thought it would be appropriate for us to pray that prayer. And and it starts with the line when the world spins out of when the world is spins crazy, um, and um, and I just find that we still live in a world that's spinning crazy, and it reminds us where we can find our grounding. And so we'll pray that prayer in just a few moments. But before we do, let's go ahead and remember to be praying for Miss Karen and Miss Karen with her cancer treatments that she's been undergoing. Thankful that we were able to see her and Miss Peggy again this weekend, and want to continue praying for them as they both were recently ill. I also want to be remembering Miss Peggy's brother Alan. Continue praying for him. Also, Miss Karen's brother Daryl. On Sunday, she said he still was not doing well, and remains on ventilation. And so just be praying for that whole situation there. Want to also ask that y'all remember my Uncle Norbert in prayer. He's still in the hospital. The kidney function is not doing well, and he's very weak. They said even before he could go home, they want him to spend a week or two in an inpatient rehabilitation hospital, and so that's that's just definitely a hard situation for him and for my Aunt Sharon. And so please be in prayer for his health and for the doctors and nurses to be able to treat him and provide him all the care that he needs. Be praying for them as well. That's a lot of trips back and forth and unstable in an unstable situation for my Aunt Sharon. So just be praying for her strength in the midst of this season, and just the Lord to provide her everything that she needs. I want to ask that we continue praying for Brother Dean and our Meemaw as they're recovering from he's recovering still yet from back surgery, and she's recovering from a fall suffered several weeks ago. Want to remember Jerry Sokol in prayer as well, who's battling cancer. Want to also keep praying for those who are grieving loss. Think about Lindsay Harris, Cotton. Think about John Hadley, my neighbor Diane for sure, and others that have lost relatives recently. And let's just remember that that pain doesn't go away just because the time has moved on, and so be praying for those folks. Also, want to continue praying for Brother Rowdy Robinette's friend Jesse, who has terminal brain cancer, for his boss who's recovering from heart surgery, and then also be praying for his mother, who's just walking through a season right now where she could use a lot of our prayers, for sure. I also want to remember our missionaries, Mike and Christy Starling. I want to remember our Mission 823 team, and they wrapped up their camps for kids throughout, mostly from Kyiv or Eastern Ukraine, came over to the West and had camps throughout the summer. But then they were also able to host a huge camp for the children of their village, and just so thankful for the work that they're doing. They're gonna pivot now and get back to just returning to developing the facilities and still running humanitarian aid and doing the other good work that they're ongoing in doing. Also supporting church plants that they're getting up off the ground, both in the West and in the East. So just some things that we can remember to be praying for. Um, and for us tonight, let's go to this prayer uh, that starts with the line, "When the world spins crazy." And this is the prayer that I'm going to offer for us tonight. And just kind of make a couple points about this prayer. What I like is that it reminds us that we're anchored in a community of faith. Sometimes we find our identity in various ways, in various tribes, in various arenas, but our main identity is our faith and with the faithful. And then it seeks to anchor us back into the biblical text, where the prayer says that that's where we find our Lord, and that's where we receive. What I hope that we can receive from this is that we can receive uh, not only truth and comfort, but that we can receive hope, so that we can remain faithfully committed to love, despite fears that we have, scarcity, despite anger and rage. We will be committed to love as Christ called us to love. So, uh, will you join me in this prayer? When the world spins crazy, spins wild and out of control, spins towards rage and hate and violence, spins beyond our wisdom and nearly beyond our faith, when the world spins in chaos as it does now among us, we are glad for sobering roots that provide ballast in the storm. So we thank you for our rootage in communities of faith, for our many fathers and mothers who have believed and trusted as firm witnesses to us, for their many stories of wonder, awe, and healing. Thank you, Lord. We are glad this night in this company for the rootage of the text, for the daring testimony, for its deep commands, for its exuberant tales, because we know that as we probe deep into this text, clear to its bottom, we will find you hiding there. We will find you showing yourself there, speaking as you do, governing, healing, judging. And when we meet you hiddenly, we find the spin not so unnerving, because from you the world again has a chance for life and a sense and wholeness. We pray amidst the spinning, not yet unnerved, but waiting and watching and listening. For you are the truth that contains all our spin. And with that, I say in Jesus' name, amen. Tonight, we're going to be looking at Job, a few chapters in Job. It's Job chapter 28 through 31. And we want to talk about somebody whose life is spinning crazy, trying to make sense of it all. That's what we find here in the book of Job. We have read and studied the prologue. We've gone through the argumentation between Job and his friends. And now we come to this place in the text where we get a soliloquy from Job over these four chapters. And then we'll move on from here. There's going to be a young man who speaks up, challenging Job and his friends, and then we'll hear God speak out of the whirlwind, and then see the epilogue of the book. But that's where we're going. But tonight, let's just look at these four chapters. As we do, this is just kind of a good moment for us just to kind of stop and think about what the big remember what the big issues are for Job. Job has lost everything. He's suffering, not only suffering loss, he's physically suffering, and his friends come and claim, hey, this could only have happened to somebody who has done something terribly wrong. And Job has maintained his innocence throughout, and he's actually sought for God to vindicate him. And we're going to see all this come up here again. And in chapter 28, he's going to ask the question, where do we find wisdom? and he's going to use images to that really are brilliant images, talking about what we can find and how it's amazing that we can't find wisdom. He's ultimately going to land on that the Lord knows where wisdom is, and he's told us that the fear of the Lord is where we find wisdom and understanding. And so from that, then Job's going to go on in chapter 29, and he is going to lament how things used to be, the way that he was honored and revered, the way that and why he was honored and revered. And then verse or chapter 30, Job is going to say, things are not that way anymore, and he names the problem, and again, this is where we have to highlight this. The problem is not even that Job has suffered loss of all these things, not even that he's physically suffering, but he's doing so, and people believe that he is he is suffering because of some horrible thing that he's done. He's lost all standing in his community. He has, and now people are turning against him, and they're attacking him, and he's going to state the reason for this. And then in chapter 31, then Job is going to come in, and he is going to make a plea and appeal again to God to weigh him on the scales of justice, and he's going to go through a laundry list of sinful things that Job could have been doing, and he's going to ask God, like, and ultimately, what I find in this chapter is Job is saying, I know the consequences for these things, which is why I haven't done them. And so then he's going to ask God again, like, I need you to speak up for me. And as we walk through these chapters, we're just going to outline them. But as we do, I want us to remember, like, the big issue for Job right now is not just I'm suffering. It's I'm suffering, and people believe that it's just suffering. And in these chapters, what I see Job saying in chapter 28 is saying, "Hey, look, where's wisdom?" He's asking this question, "Where's wisdom?" Well, where is the wisdom behind what's going on? Like, and then really what we're ultimately going to see is Job is going to show us again, like, I held on to this idea. The reason why I walked in integrity was because I trusted in strict justice and that divine retribution for and divine and consequences for bad action. Job is going to say, I trusted in this, and that's the question of where's wisdom. I was walking in this path. That's why I've lived with such integrity, and yet here I am. I've lost everything. I've lost my standing. I've lost my reputation. People think that I've done something horrible. Nothing I can say is changing their minds. And God, you're against me. I don't know why you're against me. And ultimately, he says, I need you to weigh me on the scales of justice. And Job stands tall, and he says, and I believe that if you do, if you have an accusation against me, I'll wear it like a crown, because what he believes is the accusation is that God's going to say, you've done nothing wrong. You will vindicate me ultimately. But that's what Job is longing for. That's what he wants. That's why we can't just look at Job as seeking to ask the question about, like, why do bad things happen in this world. Really, Job is pressing into this question of, is there justice in this world? Like, is there this idea of strict strict justice or divine retribution for our bad actions, or is there something more complex going on? And so with that, let's just go ahead and begin our outline of chapters 28 through 31. And so in chapter 28, he begins with this image, and he says, and he says, listen, people are pretty amazing. We can go and we can mine precious minerals and precious materials out of the earth. He says, and this is in verses 1 through 11. He says, we can find stuff hidden deep within the earth that birds flying overhead can't see, that animals crawling on the ground or walking on the ground can't see. He said we can mine these precious materials out of the earth, and he's setting up for verses 12 through 22 and chapter 28, where he says we can find all this, but we can't find wisdom. and we can't find wisdom. So 1 through 11, this really brilliantly articulated image about how we can mine things out of the earth that you can't see with the naked observable eye. We've been able to discover those things, but we can't find wisdom. And then he says, even beyond that, in those verses, in verses 12 through 22, he says we couldn't even buy wisdom. It's not something to be purchased, right? And then verses 23 through 28, which round out chapter 28, he says, God knows where it is found. And he says he operates by wisdom. And then he tells us that the fear of the Lord is wisdom and understanding. I wanted to go ahead and read those few verses, verses 23 through 28. This is in the NLT. He says, God alone understands the way to wisdom. He knows where it can be found, for he looks through the whole earth and sees everything under the heaven. He decided how hard the wind should blow and how much rain should fall. He made the laws for rain and laid out a path for the lightning. Then he saw wisdom and evaluated it. He set it in place and examined it thoroughly. And this is what he says to all humanity: the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. To forsake evil is real understanding. So the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. Two things I want to say here is Job's going, hey, we've gone through this. I don't even understand what's going on. I have no wisdom or understanding to speak into my situation, to give an answer for why I've suffered the loss that I've suffered, why I'm physically suffering. But Job is also asserting, look, what you have said is that the fear of the Lord is true wisdom, and to forsake evil, and that's where that's where wisdom and understanding come from. And now he's going to outline this lament in the next couple of chapters about the way things are. And then in chapter 31 he's going to say, and look, I followed this fear of the Lord. I lived in fear of the Lord. This is why I lived an upright, honest life where I cared for others and I wasn't greedy, right? He's going to name all these things that he's going to say, I know better basically than to do these things. And yet here I am. So help me understand. You said that wisdom is in fearing you and forsaking evil. I've done that. I've lived in fear of you. I've forsaken evil, and yet here I'm still in this state. What's going on here? And so let's just go ahead and outline chapter 29. Chapter 29, verses 1 through 6. Job longs for the days, and these are the days when, quote unquote, God watched over him. And this is in verses 1 through 6. And then he begins from there to recount what it was like. What was it like whenever God was watching over me? And this brings up another point about Job. Job, like, he can't give an answer for, like, hey, I haven't done anything to cause this stuff to happen. So the only thing that he can comprehend is that God has turned against me. He's taken his hand off of me. He stopped caring for me and providing the refuge and the security and the shelter, and now I'm vulnerable and I'm open to attack, and the attacks are coming. But before that, when God was watching over me, what was life like then? Well, verses 7 through 10 of chapter 29, Job describes how he was revered in his community. And this is a really important thing for us to consider as we get into this, because when you read this, it can sound like, oh, I miss whenever I was popular. Like, Job's not missing whenever he is popular, right? Let's think about, like, Isaiah 53, whenever it says, when they're talking about the chosen one, who they didn't know was the chosen one, and they said, surely we esteemed him stricken of God, right? We thought that he was a bad news, and that he was justly bad news, right? Because of everything. And we believe this is Isaiah 53 is talking about Jesus, and lines up very, very beautifully, actually. But somebody who gets arrested and beaten and sentenced to death and executed on a Roman cross, you don't look at that person and think that's the guy that God That's the chosen liberator of God's people. You don't look at that person and say that. You say, oh, that person, maybe if we can't even understand it, that person's getting what they deserve, right? And Job says, and this is what Job is hinting at, and what he's talking about here whenever he's talking about being revered. It's not just that like he lost popularity and he lost standing. He has done so, but he's done so unjustly, and he's done so, and so people think the reason why he's lost it is because people think that he must be hiding some terrible thing that he's done, some terrible way that he's been. He must be justly being punished by God. Verses 11 through 17, Job attests that the honor that he had in his community, he's going to give us really two reasons here in 11 through 17, and then also in verses 21 through 25. But but the reason why he was honored and revered in his community was because he was a man of justice. He took care of the poor. He took care of the needy. He stood up for the voiceless. I was practicing justice in our community. In verses 21 through 25, he's going to go on and he's going to say, and I had wisdom. People came to me for answers. They came to me for guidance, for counsel. The reason why I had standing in this community was because of the character that I had, right? It wasn't just because I had a lot of stuff. It was because of the content of the man, right? In the middle of those two sections in verses 18 through 20, Job tells us kind of like whenever I was living this life where God was watching over me, I thought this is what I thought. I thought I'm gonna I'm going to live a long life. I'm going to die at a ripe old age, right? And I'm going to have my family gathered around. I'm going to die with honor. I'm going to die with dignity. But what is Job facing right now? He's physically not well. If he dies, he's not dying with honor. He's not dying with integrity. He's not dying revered. He's going to be like the like Isaiah 53, right? He's going to die, and everybody's going to think he got what he deserves. And so this is Job's lament, and his complaint is that things are not like they once were whenever God was watching over me. And that's the big thing too. There was a time whenever I knew God was watching over me, and now it seems like the Almighty has turned against me. And that brings us to Job chapter 30. In chapter 30, he kind of states the way things are now, right? He says in verses 1 through 15, and just to summarize those verses, he says, "But now worthless people mock me," and he states it explicitly. Why are worthless people mocking him? People of ill repute who are mocking him. In verse 11, he says, "For God has cut my bowstring; He has humbled me, so they have thrown off all restraint." Right? Because now that my protection is God, my God has cut my bowstring. I have no defense against them, so now they're coming at me. Right? I used to be under God's watch. Now God's face is against me. Now God's security is away from me. I've been forsaken. I've been abandoned by God. One of the things we haven't really talked about this throughout the book of Job, but there is a big scholarly discussion over whether or not Job is in line with like a lot of the Old Testament. And one of the things that we know about a lot of the Old Testament is it was compiled, like these writings were all compiled in the exile or the late exilic period, and what the Old Testament is striving to do in large part is answer the question for Israel: how did we end up in exile? And did God forsake us? Did he forsake the covenant? These are questions that come up all throughout the Old Testament. I was reading Psalm 89 yesterday, and Psalm 89, it talks about God's faithfulness and how he made this covenant with David. And he said, I'll be faithful to my anointed and basically to the throne and to his generations after him. I'll never not be faithful to him. And then it says, but you have. You've let your anointed, you've let your anointed be overthrown, right? The monarchy is gone. Um, and then it prays the prayer. How long? How much longer do we have to do this? God, we trust that you're faithful. When are you going to show your faithfulness again? And so I say all that to say that whenever they read it in light of this, they read Job in light of this as well as maybe yes, it could be a historical figure, and we've talked about this before, but it also could be the whole nation like identifying with this character and saying, we lost everything and we can't give an answer for it. Now, we know that there's prophetic answers about idolatry and forsaking the covenant. There's prophetic answers about that they were uh that they were not doing justice for the voiceless and the marginalized. Like, we know that there's those answers, but what we need to also understand historically is this was a discussion, and as lively as a discussion as we would have today in our political structure about why things happen and what do they mean, and was it right or wrong. I mean, you only have to look to like an issue like the January 6th situation that happened in 2021 to know that there's conversation around this. As much as there's lively conversation today, there was then, and we actually have a lot of that lively conversation recorded in Scripture. And Job is part of this existential, could be part of this existential crisis that they're facing. Is why did God turn against us? Why did God turn against us? But that's just another layer. We're looking at the story here. We know that Job is longing to be vindicated. He is here in chapter 30 now saying, hey, worthless people are mocking me, right? I've lost all standing, and so now even the dregs of society feel like they can come and attack me. This is a bad state for Job to be in. And in verses, that's verses 1 through 15 of chapter 30, and verses 16 through 23, he goes on to say, not only are they out to get me, but then he says, I have no defense. And he has no defense because God has cruelly and violently turned against me. And I just want to pick up a verse from that section. It says, with a strong hand, God grabs me by the shirt. He grips me by the collar, and he's thrown me into the mud. I am nothing more than dust and ashes. Wow, this is how Job feels right now. He's been completely, God's turned against him. He's been completely abandoned and forsaken. And so in verses 16 through 23, he says, I have no defense. And then he also picks up in this section and he says, and I cry out to you, God, and you're not even answering me. In verses 24 through 31, rounding out chapter 30 of Job, he says, look, if anybody saw somebody in need, in desperate need, they would attend to them, right? And he uses this image and this kind of scenario, and he says, yet I've cried out to you, and you haven't attended to me. Job's really at the depths here. And then in Job chapter 31, he comes in and in verses 1 through 4, and he's going to say, like, remember whenever I was under your watch, remember whenever before you had turned against me. uh, I lived a life of integrity, and this is why I lived a life of integrity, because I really did fear you. And I really did fear the consequences of making bad choices and bad decisions and treating people unfairly or unjustly. I considered all these things, and that's why I set my life out to be a life of integrity. And then he's going to come in and say, so I need you to weigh me on the scales of justice, and trusting that there won't be an accusation that you can bring against me that would prove that any of this is wrong. And so what Job really wants to set up to his friends and say is, you got to let go of this idea of uh, of strict justice, and this idea that there's this divine retribution. There's something more going on here in this world. We can't just say, bad things happen to bad people, or people suffer the consequences. That doesn't happen that way. There's more going on here. And so I just kind of want to read the first few verses of chapter 31. No, verses 1 through 4. He tells us why, and the reason why he's lived a life of integrity is because he fears the Lord, and he knows the consequences of bad decisions and of treating people unfairly. Verses 5 through 8 is where he pleads with the Lord, and he says, have I lied to anyone or deceived anyone? Let God weigh me on the scales of justice, for he knows my integrity. If I have strayed from his pathway, or if my heart has lusted for what my eyes have seen, or if I am found guilty of any other sin, then let someone else eat the crops I have planted, let all that I have planted be uprooted. Listen, God, I trust that I've not done anything to deserve all that I've forsaken. And again, we've talked about this and we'll continue talking about that. It's not that Job never sinned, it's that he doesn't have any unaccounted for sin. And it also is back to the prologue. Job lived a very upright life. He was a man devoted to integrity. And in fact, Job's life almost looks like a caricature of somebody that you would say is pious or righteous, right? It's like it's almost unreal to read the prologue and go like, wow, that man, this guy was really, really about it, right? Um, and so he sets that out in verses 5 through 8. He asks God to weigh him on the scales of justice, and then beginning in verse 9, he's going to go through a whole bunch of different scenarios, a whole bunch of different sinful things, and yeah, sinful ways that he could have been living, that could answer for it. And as we go through these, I'm just going to list them out. But the one thing that I kind of see happening here is he's saying, I like he poses it like this: if I've done this, then this would happen. And the way I want us to understand it is Job is basically saying, I didn't do this because I knew the consequences. I didn't do this because I knew the consequences. I didn't do this because I knew the consequences. And most this whole section follows that pattern. And so in verses 9 through 12, he says, I haven't lusted after anybody, after another woman, or after another man's wife, because I know the shame and consequence of what that would mean. I know that would mean that my wife shouldn't be special to me, that she should go serve somebody else, right? Verses 13 through 15, he says, I know that both I and my servant are equally created by God. And I couldn't face God if I treated a servant poorly. So I've not treated my servants harshly or withheld from them. In verses 16 through 20, he says, like, I've not refused to feed the hungry or to clothe the naked. Like, the consequences of me not feeding the hungry is that they go hungry. The consequences of me not clothing the naked is that they're cold in the winter, right? And they're not protected from the elements in the summer. I know the consequences of these things, so I've 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 committed my life to following in these ways. He says in verses 21 through 23, I know that oppressing the voiceless is wrong, and I would have no standing with God and only be in danger of his judgment. And he goes so far as to say, I would rather my arm be torn off away from my body than me have to stand and face God's judgment for testifying against somebody who has no voice in our community. I, I'm not ready to stand before God only to get the approval of the judges there, verses 24 and 25, he says, I know better than finding security in my wealth. Like, that's not where you were watching over me. My wealth wasn't watching over me, right? Verse 26 through 28, he says, I know not to look at the sun or the moon or the stars and worship them, because if I had done that, it would mean that I was denying God. Right? I know these things. This is why I've lived up my life the way that I've lived my life. In verses 29 through 30, he says, I've never found joy in the calamity or the disaster that came upon my enemies, and I never even prayed for curses upon them. Like, I know that that's just not good character. That's not good art, to do that. That's not a wise way to live. Verses 31 through 32, he says, I've never refused to host foreign travelers. Like, I've always been hospitable and welcoming to people. You could ask my servants this, right? In verses 33 through 34, he says, I've not even tried to conceal my sin. Like, if I've done wrong, I've owned up to it. I've been accountable for it. And he makes a statement there. He says, I've not been so concerned about what other people think about me so that I would hide it. Right? I've brought it out into the open, and I've made amends for it, and I've sought forgiveness for it, because I know the consequences of not doing that are disastrous, and we can know that it's like a cancer that eats you, and it creates problems and your reputation and your standing, right? And so he says all this, he lays out all this, and it's, God, I know better than to do these things. That's why I haven't done them. You know that I haven't done them. And so in verses 35 through 37, he comes back again and he says, if only someone would hear me. And he wants God to hear him. And he says, and let him write his charge against me. And he says, and if he did, I would wear it like a crown because I would come out like I'd come out like a prince because his charge against me would be not guilty, not guilty. In verses 38 through 40, he wraps up these questions or this whole these whole chapter, and he says, listen, if the land accuses me, let it speak out. And what he means by that, if I've stolen crops or I've murdered landowner owners, then here's how the land can speak out. Whenever I plant wheat, let thistles grow. Whenever I plant barley, let weeds grow. Like I need there to be something that speaks that shows that either I'm horribly mistaken in how I've tried to live my life, and I haven't been living a life of integrity, or I have been living a life of integrity, and this suffering is not some result of strict justice because of my wrong behavior. I need to be vindicated. I need it to be known. Now, as we take in this story, we know that God's going to speak to Job. We know that he's going to have that Job's going to respond to God, and that's going to happen in a little bit. First, we're going to look at his the young man's argument both to Job and to the friends in the next few chapters. But one of the things that I think is really, really, really something that we can hold on to is you and I know, like we know that we fall short of the glory of God, right? But Paul uses this language in Romans where he says, we've been justified by God. We've been made right in His sight. We like even though we know there is guilt, like we because of Christ will stand before Him and we will receive vindication, right? um, not guilty. We'll be told, not because of what we've done, but because of what Jesus has done. That's how we think about this theologically. And so here's what I would say is Job ordered his life in such a way so that he would not be found guilty. And here's what God gives to us. He gives us this declaration that you aren't guilty, not so that we can go live lasciviously, but so that we can walk as those who are people of integrity, so that we can be freed from working for this. Like Job was very meticulous about these things. He knew, like I know if I do this, that we've been freed so that we can follow a life of integrity, of character, of being honorable and wise, being people who care for the needs of others, who live out of love and compassion. We can do that freely, not with this burden. We can do that freely now because of what Christ has done for us. And so I would say, let's go out living as though we are not guilty. And whenever I say that, let's live the lives of integrity that match that not guilty verdict. And I think with that,